Senator Batters.
Honourable Senators, what Parliament has done with this assisted suicide bill is shameful. The Trudeau government, supported by the Bloc Québécois, halted debate after only 7.5 hours of debate on a Senate amendment to allow access to state-sanctioned suicide for people suffering with mental illness. Because mental illness as a sole underlying condition had been specifically excluded from medically assisted death in the original Bill C-7, the House of Commons had not previously studied or debated the issue at all. It is reprehensible that the amount of House time devoted to such a monumental change in our country's social policy is less than 1 day's work shift for many Canadians. This entire debacle illustrates that we have a Prime Minister who is governing without a moral compass, leading a cabinet of ministers more interested in ducking their heads to keep their jobs than they are in standing up for Canadians. In the same week, Prime Minister Trudeau breathlessly celebrated International Women's Day, and his government held a 2-day virtual summit on women's issues. He forced through this extremely harmful amendment that will disproportionately affect women. With this mental illness amendment, many vulnerable mentally ill women in Canada will have access to the guaranteed lethal means to end their lives, instead of being provided the support and help to live and thrive. And while we've known for a while that Justin Trudeau is a fake feminist, this government mental illness amendment also proves he's a fake mental health advocate. I guess we shouldn't be surprised. When Justin Trudeau was an MP, he charged local mental health associations $20,000 a pop as his speaking fee. This is horrendous, especially since he was an MP, and speaking to groups like that about important issues of public policy is actually part of his job. His Liberal caucus members followed his lead, including those who had previously won national mental health awards: Carolyn Bennett, Sean Fraser, Patty Hajdu, Seamus O'Regan, and even the chair of the Parliamentary Mental Health Caucus, Liberal MP Majid Jawari. They all fell into line to vote against people with mental illness when their political fortunes in Justin Trudeau's Liberal caucus were on the line. To add insult to injury, Prime Minister Trudeau forced through this amendment on the COVID National Day of Observance and the anniversary of Canada's ratification of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, a convention which 3 UN human rights experts, including 2 special rapporteurs, told us Bill C-7 violates. You can't even make this stuff up. Bill C-7 betrays so many groups of people that Prime Minister Trudeau likes to pretend he supports, including women, Indigenous peoples, persons with disabilities, and Black and racialized Canadians. And now the Trudeau government has added people with mental illness to the list. This amendment will be devastating for these vulnerable people. When Bill C-14 was introduced 5 years ago, the Trudeau government was forced to stand down on including mental illness in that bill. That was, of course, when Jody Wilson-Raybould was Justice Minister and Jane Philpott was Health Minister. When those 2 ministers were ousted from the Liberal cabinet, it seems that courage and common sense left with them. Instead, we have an activist expansionist Justice Minister, David Lametti. He voted against Bill C-14 because he felt it didn't go far enough. When asked about this issue in a recent media interview, he stated that 30 years ago, he clerked for Supreme Court Justice Peter Corey, who was a dissenter in the Rodriguez-assisted dying case. Clearly, this formed a key part of Minister Lametti's early legal philosophy. This has been his mission for 30 years. It did strike me as odd that Minister Lametti would not hit lob-ball questions when I asked him to defend the constitutionality of the mental illness exclusion in Bill C-7. I defended the constitutionality of that part more vigorously than he did. He also failed to correct the GBA plus gender analysis of the bill. And then miraculously, the majority Trudeau Independent Senate amended the bill to expand the boundaries for assisted dying much, much farther than originally expected. Lickety-split, the amendments rammed through the House of Commons in only 7.5 hours. Prime Minister Trudeau used the supposedly independent Senate to play the heavy for what he and Minister Lametti wanted to do: radically expand assisted suicide. During and after last fall's pre-study on Bill C-7 at the Senate Legal Committee, many ISG senators were opposed to the bill on behalf of persons with disabilities, Indigenous peoples, Black and racialized minorities, and people with mental illness. But by February of this year, it was a whole different story. All of a sudden, ISG senators who had been dead set against expanding assisted suicide were open or at least resigned to it. Even though many ISG senators had raised numerous concerns during the pre-study, Almost the only amendments proposed from the ISG were minor ones, with the notable exception of Senator Kutcher's 18-month sunset clause on the mental illness exclusion. On the first day we discussed amendments on Bill C-7 in the chamber, Senator Kutcher spoke first and moved his sunset clause amendment before we had even delivered our general speeches on the theme of mental illness, an order that made little sense. But it served the Trudeau government's purpose of framing the debate about MAID for mental illness and ultimately produced the outcome the Justice Minister had wanted all along, expanding assisted suicide to people suffering with mental illness. And the ISG sponsor of the bill and the leader of the government in the Senate stared at the floor when the time came to defend the mental illness exclusion in the legislation. Curiouser and curiouser. The government has played fast and loose in its communication about the studies on mental illness it promises once Bill C-7 is passed. It is shocking that the government is opening access to MAID for those with mental illness before they have even studied the issue. And while the original Senate mental illness amendment was open-ended, the government amendment before us today is much more prescribed. This makes it crystal clear that the expert panel will not determine whether to expand MAID to include mental illness, but rather how to include it, a significant difference. The government has used parliamentarians' confusion on this issue to its own advantage, to the point where I think many MPs and senators aren't even clear on what they are voting on. When I asked Government Leader Gold to clarify this for us yesterday, he couldn't or wouldn't, even after 3 separate attempts. The Bloc Québécois, who propped up the Liberal government to invoke closure and ram the government mental illness amendment through the House of Commons, didn't understand what they agreed to either. In a press conference, BQ leader Yves-François Blanchet indicated that any debate about the mental illness amendment would be sent to an ad hoc committee. Other Bloc MPs stated their completely mistaken belief that the 24-month sunset clause would be used to determine whether mental illness would be included. Justice Minister Lamette's responses have been highly evasive on this topic, trying to placate what I have reliably heard was a large number of Liberal backbenchers extremely nervous about his mental illness about-face. So I asked you, honourable senators, in voting for this amendment to expand access to MAID, are you 100% certain what you're voting for? As with assisted suicide, there are no do-overs here. Make no mistake, this amendment will not give parliamentarians additional time to discuss whether to expand MAID for mental illness. It will only give us a how-to manual. But the impact this bill will have on vulnerable Canadians, especially those suffering with mental illness, will be immeasurable and irreversible. Some senators maintain that medical assistance in dying and suicide are completely different. I totally disagree. The only difference is that suicide is taking one's life by one's own hand, and MAID leaves the taking of one's life to a medical practitioner. As Dr. John Marr says, quote, "Those who claim suicide is impulsive and violent, while MAID is well thought out, peaceful, and dignified, are arbitrarily redefining what suicide is. Suicide is taking steps to cause your own death, whatever the steps. 75% of people plan their suicide, and many are completed with care and consideration of the impact on first responders and others. The characterization of all suicides as compelled, impulsive, and violent is factually wrong and perpetuates media stereotypes. What is clear is that suicide is a raw agony for loved ones. The trappings of medical comfort and the mutual pretense of moral exoneration that the staging of the MAID event promises cannot diminish this sorrow. In fact, it can serve to inflame the wound through the betrayal by both medicine and state," unquote. I am entirely unconvinced MAID for mental illness would be, as some senators have proposed, better for families. I know all too well what it is to be a family survivor of suicide, and I can assure you my grief would not have been any less agonizing if medically assisted suicide had been an option for my own husband. I'm sure I would have blamed a horrible, uncaring government and incompetent medical practitioners for facilitating death as an option for him. A few weeks ago, I did an interview about the expansion of assisted suicide for mental illness on the Saskatchewan Talk Radio call-in show John Gormley Live. We heard from people who had suffered from mental illness. They would have accessed MAID then if it had been made available, but now they have recovered and live fulfilling lives. Callers like Tom, who said, quote, "If I choke up a little talking to you, stick with me. I've suffered with mental illness for close to 40 years. I've contemplated suicide more than once. It's not an easy place to be. There's times when, yeah, I really wish it was an option, and there's times I'm glad it wasn't because I might have taken it," unquote. Another listener, Erica, said, quote, "I pulled my car over and I'm texting and I'm in tears. As a 20-year-old young woman, I became incredibly mentally ill. I was hospitalized for months. I went from a young woman who had her life ahead of her to someone who lost her family because they could not care for me. One therapist mentioned I may never live independently again. I had no will to live. And then I found the right treatment and the right medication and a reason to live. 25 years later, I live a life of gratitude. I'm a good mother to my children. I have 2 degrees. I'm employed successfully. I own a home. I have not fallen ill since I received my proper treatment," unquote. Jeff texted, quote, "I am totally against the bill to allow assisted suicide for the mentally ill. I'm now afraid for my son. Several years ago, he begged us for months to take him to Europe to end his life. It was legal in some countries then. He's tried different meds. He's now relatively stable. If he has a relapse or goes off his meds, which often can happen, he now has this as an option," unquote. Another listener, Lauren, emailed me to express his frustration. He said, quote, "I went to my doctor to get a referral to seek some help with my depression. He increased my dosage of meds. Took a month to get a phone call from a counselor, which was today. They called and canceled the appointment. In-person appointments are not on with COVID. The intake worker said to see a psychiatrist is months down the road and could not give me a date. And then the government wants to kill people like us?" Quote. These are the people I'm standing up for on this issue. These are the voices I always try to bring to this debate. These are the people I will never stop fighting for. So now that Parliament has opened Pandora's box, where is all this heading? Very few jurisdictions around the world have approved MAID for mental illness, but of those that do, depression and anxiety are often cited as leading reasons for access. Psychiatric MAID in the Netherlands has been granted for patients who have a variety of psychiatric conditions, including substance abuse, eating disorders, autism, prolonged grief, obsessive-compulsive disorder, kleptomania, and hypochondria. In one study, 56% of psychiatric patients had refused at least some treatment. In 2019, 34 cases of euthanasia were performed simultaneously on both members of a couple. And in case there's any doubt where this issue is going next in Canada, Minister Lametti stated recently, quote, "We are going to go ahead with the mental illness issue and the minors issue at the next stage," quote. The minors issue? The next frontier is children. It's shocking. There is no doubt in my mind that Bill C-7 will be found unconstitutional because it is discriminatory to persons with disabilities. We'll see if Minister Lametti accepts the next legal challenge to the constitutionality of this bill from a lower court judgment on that basis as readily as he accepted the Truchon decision. Honourable Senators, I woke up the morning after the House of Commons passed this assisted suicide Bill C-7 last week, and I thought, was that a nightmare? Did that really happen last night? I turned on CPAC, and it was broadcasting the Senate Legal Committee hearings on this bill. On the screen, I saw the face of witness Jonathan Marchand, a person with disabilities who compared his life in a long-term care home to that of an inmate in prison. He implored us not to pass this bill, given that it will discriminate further against Canadians with disabilities by giving them easier access to a certain death than the supports necessary to live. Seeing Jonathan's face made me even sadder. Not only has Parliament failed Jonathan and millions of Canadians like him by passing Bill C-7, but this chamber and now the House of Commons have blown this bill wide open by expanding assisted suicide to include Canadians with mental illness. Honourable colleagues, if you cast your vote to pass this bill, I hope you will stop and remember the faces of the many Canadians you are turning your back on. You want to provide Canadians with a beautiful death, but why not give them the means to a beautiful life instead? Assisted suicide might end the chances of life getting worse, but it also eliminates the possibility of life ever getting better. We can't give up on vulnerable Canadians. Please don't vote to sunset their lives. Thank you.